If you're making your first comic or manga, you've probably heard the word world building so many times that it's starting to feel like homework. And when you sit down to actually do it, it's so overwhelming. Maps and cultures and magic systems and politics and lore. The truth is, most beginners make the exact same mistakes, and I've made them myself. So today, I wanted to walk you through what I think are the 7 biggest beginner mistakes in world building for comics and manga, and more importantly, how to avoid them. I'll share some lessons from my own series, Ye Olde Treehouse, and by the end of this, you'll know how to build a world that actually supports your story instead of holding you back. You know that feeling when you've spent weeks drawing maps, naming cities, and designing armor, and you still don't know what your main character wants? Well, that's the first big trap. You're building the stage before you know the play. When I first started Ye Olde Treehouse, I did have this itch to flesh out all of Viso right away. I wanted every location, every historical event, but then I realized that my characters were not even moving yet. I didn't know what Rue's journey was going to look like beyond captain on an adventure to hunt a crazy ringmaster. So I stopped and I asked myself this one question. What's the actual story that I'm trying to tell first? And this is related to the theme. And my belief is that if you don't have a theme, you're going to have a very hard time writing a cohesive and understandable story. So once I had the theme, the world building became the focus. I only needed to fully design Glory Peak because that's where the story begins. And its divided culture mirrors Rue's own split confidence as captain. So the rest of the world I figured could evolve as the characters travel through it. So to fix this, you start with your story's core conflict or theme and then build only the parts of your world that your characters will directly touch in your first arc. The rest can grow later. And before you go back to drawing maps and all of this intricate stuff, ask yourself, am I telling a story or am I just decorating an empty room? Now, I know some people might disagree with me with regards to theming, but I genuinely believe that if you don't have a theme, you have no idea what story you're trying to tell. Everything goes back to the theme. Everything goes back to the message of your story. So before you even decide to go into the nitty-gritty of world building, make sure you have a theme. So the next mistake, if you listen to anything in this video, please listen to this one because this is the most common mistake that I see beginners make in comics and manga. It is overloading with lore. And I know when you're first starting, you love creating the worlds and it's fun, but the second trap is dumping all of the lore on the reader right away. You know, you might have pages of history in the world and giant blocks of narration and characters who stop the action to explain exactly what they're doing with their abilities. And in my own work, I too was tempted to tell the readers everything about augurs, which are the power system in Ye Olde, because I felt like if I don't explain it, they're not going to get it. They're not going to understand. But the reality is, if I did that in chapter 1, it would have completely broken away from the immersion of the story. And to be real, if the reader doesn't care about your characters yet, they're not going to care about your character system. So what I did was I revealed just enough to keep the plot moving and only added details when the character needed them. So Rue doesn't need to learn certain truths about augurs until much later in the story, so the reader learns alongside with her. And that way, the lore becomes part of the journey in the story instead of feeling like homework that you have to read through. So the fix for this mistake is to show your world through action, visuals, and small bits of dialogue. And reveal lore only when it impacts the scene right now. If you've ever written a paragraph of a backstory and thought, but the reader needs to know this, you should really ask yourself, do they really need it now, or am I just eager to show off my world? Okay, this next mistake is a little bit more nuanced, but it's equally important, and that is ignoring the reader's entry point. Even if your world is amazing, if readers can't find a way in, they're going to leave. So the mistake here is starting your comic deep inside a complex world without giving the audience a relatable anchor. There are so many ways I could have made this mistake in Ye Olde Treehouse because there's different cultures and languages, there's political tension and, government hierarchies and military hierarchies. And I could have started with all of that, but that's not what hooks a new reader. Instead, I introduced the regulation, Fig and Rue, through their mission to capture Drindith, who is a circus master with really powerful illusion powers. I thought it was high energy, easy to grasp, and it lets the readers discover the bigger world naturally. So to fix this, mistake of ignoring the reader's entry point, you give your readers a guide. So often a newcomer POV, like a new character or a familiar situation that everybody has understood or gone through so that they can orient themselves. And you let the reader walk through the door before you show them the entire castle that you've built. So ask yourself, if a stranger read my first chapter, would they feel like they understand? Would they feel welcome? Pay close attention to the entry point for the reader in your story. Mistake number 4, aesthetic without function. And some people may disagree with me on this one, but I do believe that when it comes to world building and creating things as well as character design, that 4 times out of 5, you should probably have an answer when you're asked, well, why? Why does this look like that? Why is that thing there? The reason why is that I feel like if you have a purpose for the things that you create, you can more easily tie it to the overall geography and culture and power system and history, or the story's conflict as a whole. So for example, in my manga Yield Treehouse, there are all sorts of giant flora. There's a giant mushroom spore thing in Leitowood, there's a giant oak tree in Glory Peak, and there's a somewhat sizable oak tree on the Nosferry Circus compound. And someone may ask, well, why are all of these things so massive in this world? And I could say because I like it, and that's fine. Like, you can absolutely do that, but it's much more powerful and you can get a lot more story out of it if you have an answer to that question. So in Yield Treehouse, these plants are super huge because they're empowered by something called natural magic. So they're not like your regular flora and fauna. So I can easily fit in some storyline elements to the fact that these plants are so huge because there's a reason why they're so huge. So, you can definitely just make things look and be the way they are because they're that way, and that's totally fine. You don't have to have a why for everything, but I find that the more answers you have to the why in your world, the stronger those elements become, and the more you can pull story out of those things too. So for every design choice, always try to ask yourself, why does this exist? And, tie it to geography, culture, history, power system if you can, or if you want to. The 5th beginner mistake is no rules for magic or tech. So this conversation can kind of get into the hard and soft magic discussion, which I'm not really going to talk about here, but I do think regardless of whether or not you have soft or hard magic power system, you should have some baseline rules for how magic works in your world. And that doesn't mean that, you've got to create this like well-crafted, defined power system. Like, that's more hard magic, but you should have at least an idea of what goes and what doesn't go into your world. Because if you don't, I think this is where you could get into some trouble. You'll have magic and technology that work however the plot needs them to, basically. And we call that ass pulling. Okay. So with augurs in Yield Treehouse, I set some rules very early. I set the rule that augurs reflect an innate trait of their wielder called their innatus. So whatever augur that a person gets is related to some inherent trait within them. And for the main characters, I set a rule that eventually the augurs that they have will consume them, because they have some funky ones. They have some that are kind of bad. So those rules shape the overall plot, and no matter what, I have to stick to them. So Rue can't suddenly have super strength because she's a psychic. She has psychic abilities because she thinks deeply, and she's an empath, and so she can think deeply about other people, right down to what they themselves are thinking. These are kind of the ways that I add those rules that make sense, without getting into, hard magic. If you do have a hard magic power system, like, obviously you need your rules, you need to stick to them. Like, if you're doing something more like Jujutsu Kaisen that is like super well defined and intricate, but for me, I'm doing a soft magic system, but even with that magic system, I still have those baseline rules so that I can make sure that they work with the plot, not whenever the plot needs something, I just decide to do this thing. So to fix this problem, create simple and consistent rules and stick to them. And the more limits that you have, the more creative your character's solutions will be, and the more tension that you'll have in your scene. So you can ask yourself, could my reader explain how my magic or tech works after a few chapters if it's been introduced in those chapters? And if you feel like they can't or they don't understand, then consider simplifying. Additionally, reconsider front loading your rules for your power system in the beginning. Please, I beg of you, do not front load this stuff in the beginning of your work. I don't care if you're doing a battle shonen. I don't care. The reality is characters are the crucial starting point of any story, any manga especially, and you want to lead with them first. So before you decide to dump 20 pages of power system on your reader, just consider maybe giving your character a strong introduction first. The next mistake is one-dimensional cultures, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time with this, particularly for you fantasy folks out there, because this is really, really important if you're doing a fantasy adventure work. It's really easy to create a warrior tribe or a scholar city where everyone acts the same, but that's not how real cultures work. Every single group has subcultures and contradictions and internal conflicts. In Yield Treehouse, the main country, Glory Peak, is divided into two regions. There's New Alta Izera, which is a high-tech side, the tech bro side, and there is New Alta Dircha, which is traditional. They've got the Nosferatu Circus. They're not as receptive to technology. Even within those regions, people disagree about politics and religion and the roles of augurs. And it's that internal diversity that makes the world feel alive. To give you another example, Letawood, which is sort of like a foresty, lush land that's a bit south of Glory Peak, similarly has a language, and there are prehistoric animals there, and they dress a certain way. One thing that I see a lot in indie manga is when, particularly with fantasy works, as you can tell, I have a very hard time with the word particularly with fantasy works, is a very one-dimensional presentation of a new location. So if you tell me that we're going to this, like a castle region, right? And it's somewhat based off of, you could say, 18th century Europe. But when I look at how you're presenting it, it's basically the same as any modern city, and the buildings just kind of look like generic, just generic European style buildings. There's no way the reader's going to really be able to fully immerse into that world. And it's just going to feel very dull. So what you want to do is give your cultures variety. And this includes the building style. This includes the dressing style. If there are little things here and there that people wear, or, things that signify status, and add perspectives within the same group of people, because not every person in that culture is going to do things the same exact way. You can create cultures that even challenge the norm of their society. This makes things way more interesting, and it makes the world feel so much alive. And a culture with no internal tension or just internal nuance is just a costume. So for my fantasy folks out there, if you get anything out of this video, this is the biggest one for you. If you have a story where your characters are traveling through a world and going to different locations, you want to make sure each of those locations stand on their own in a very strong and unique manner. You want to make sure that the reader can actually feel like they're in a new place based off of various things, right? So take extra time with that. Take extra time building out your cultures, and it's not just the people of the locations, and it's also the way it looks, like I said. So the geography, the architect, etc. If you're doing a fantasy, this is your bread and butter one right here. So try to avoid those one-dimensional cultures. The last beginner mistake, and this one is kind of low-key an advanced topic, but we're going to put it in here anyway, is forgetting to let the world change, treating your world like a static backdrop. In a good story, the world changes because of what the characters do. So the changes that occurred based off of battles and decisions the characters make, they ripple outward and they create new problems and new opportunities for your characters. A lot of times we forget that the world itself is a character as well, and because of this, it can react and respond to choices and decisions that your characters make. So let me give you a prime example. In chapter 9, at this point, I don't even remember the chapters in Yield Trails because we're on chapter 21. I think it's chapter 9 or chapter 10. There are these big wasp bug-like creatures that burst out of the ground in a location called Josho Town Square in Letawood. And, it's a big explosion, basically, that they burst out of the ground, things are destroyed, people should be scared, the area should be damaged, there should be some sort of reaction by the locals for what occurred. You want to make sure that when things happen to the world, that it stays that way, that there's an actual reaction. Treat the world in your story, in your comic, like a living thing. Don't just treat it as a backdrop, let it respond to the story. This is not just a matter of like, characters fought here and this thing got destroyed. This is also, seasons and things that affect different times of day, Remember that the world itself is a living character too, and that you can use it to your advantage to create something that feels really interesting and really compelling. A lot of people forget about that. The backgrounds, as much as we all love drawing them, and that's completely sarcasm, they're characters too, and they can add a lot to your story if you are treating them like a living thing. World building doesn't mean to build everything at once. It's about making a living stage for your characters, a place that changes, reacts, and feels real. If you're just starting out and it's your first time writing a story, making a comic or manga, then keep it simple. Build for the story that you're telling right now and let the rest grow with you. Now, I talked a lot about what you should and shouldn't do, but of course, you want to know, well, why should I listen to you? What do you know? Well, I have 20 chapters of my own manga called Ye Olde Treehouse, and if you want to see how I put each of these principles into practice, you can check it out at yeoldetreehouse.com and also on Global Comics. The full series, as of right now, is online, and this YouTube channel is my behind the scenes. And if you want sketches and storyboards and all that other stuff, I share them on Patreon if you're interested too. It's really my way of taking you along on this journey as I build and publish my own manga from scratch as we shoot for the absolute ever-loving stars to get this thing in front of as many people as possible, because fantasy adventure is underrepresented right now, and I mean that. So I'd love to hear in the comments, what is the hardest part of world building for you? Is it starting small? Is it keeping things consistent? Is it something else? Let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. And as usual, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.